We spend more time with our coworkers than we do with our own families. We sit next to them, we eat with them, and we trust them. But do we really know who they are? What happens when the person sitting in the cubicle next to you isn't just awkward, but dangerous? I was 20 years old when I landed my first real internship at a financial firm in Chicago. It wasn't a glamorous job, mostly data entry and sitting in front of a computer all day, but it paid decently. We were all crammed together in an open office section. Most of the other interns were chill, down-to-earth college students. But then, there was Kevin. Kevin was something else entirely. He was tall, incredibly thin, and had pale skin that looked like porcelain. But it wasn't his look that threw me off. It was the way he acted. Specifically, how he acted around me. At first, it was subtle. He'd pop up at my cubicle, leaning over the divider. Because the walls were low, only his head would be visible. He'd tilt his head slightly, grin with this strange, frozen smile, and start talking in a deliberately weird, robotic voice. He'd say random things like, "Are we having fun yet?" and then hold the smile for way too long, unblinking. I'd laugh it off awkwardly, thinking he was just trying to be funny. But he started doing it every single day. At least once a day, I'd see his head slowly rise above my cubicle wall, that same stretched grin plastered across his face. The other interns laughed it off, calling him Quirky Kevin, but they didn't see the dead look in his eyes when he looked at me. It was like I was his prey. Then one night, about 6 weeks into the internship, I was home eating dinner when my phone rang. It was a restricted number. I picked it up. For a few seconds, there was just heavy breathing. Then, suddenly, I heard a voice I recognized immediately. It was Kevin. He whispered, "The ice is cracking. Don't fall in." But then his voice got louder, almost a yell. He dragged the words out like a nursery rhyme, and then he burst out laughing. This insanely unhinged, high-pitched laughter before hanging up. The thing that made my skin crawl wasn't just the call. It was the fact that I never gave Kevin my number. Not once. When I went to work on Monday, Kevin wasn't there. My boss told me he had been fired the previous week for staring at a blank screen for 8 hours straight. When I asked how Kevin got my number, my boss was confused. Interns didn't have access to employee files. I thought that was the end of it. But a week later, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. to a strange scratching noise outside. It was still pitch black. I walked to my window and peeked through the blinds. Standing in my backyard, halfway between the trees and my porch, was a figure. Even in the dark, I knew who it was. The thin frame, the messy hair. It was Kevin. He was looking straight up at my window. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I just stared at him. Then, clear as day, he called out my name. He dragged it out, singing it like a lullaby. I grabbed my phone to call the police, and that's when he saw me. He tilted his head back and started laughing. That same loud, hysterical laughter like he did on the phone. It didn't sound right. It sounded like someone completely detached from humanity. I screamed that I was calling the cops. He just stood there for a second longer, waved his hand slowly, then turned and walked calmly into the woods, still laughing as he disappeared into the darkness. I never saw him again after that. But sometimes, I still wonder how long he had been watching me before I woke up. If you are enjoying this story so far and want to support the channel, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe with the bell icon on. It really helps us bring you more true horror stories like this one. Now, you might think that was my only bad experience with a coworker, but a few years later, at a different job, something even more terrifying happened. I was 26, working at a small logistics office in Ohio. It was a quiet job, tucked behind an industrial park. I usually worked the day shift, but on this particular Friday, a massive storm warning was issued. By 3 p.m., the sky turned a bruised purple color, and the rain started pouring so heavily you couldn't see the parking lot. My manager let most people leave early, but I volunteered to stay late to finish some invoices. The only other person who stayed was a guy named Arthur. Arthur had just started working there 2 weeks prior. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, and very quiet. He never said much, but he was always lurking. If I went to get water, he'd be there. If I was at the printer, he'd be watching from his desk. By 5 p.m., the storm was raging. Thunder shook the windows in their frames. The office felt empty and creepy. Arthur was sitting at his desk, just tapping one key over and over again. Every time I looked up, he was glancing at me sideways. Around 6:30, the power finally gave out. The office went pitch black, except for the faint red glow of the emergency exit signs. "Well," I said, trying to break the tension, "I guess that's it for today." Arthur didn't respond. Then I heard it, the sound of keys jingling, and then the distinct click of the front door deadbolt sliding shut. "You can't leave yet," Arthur muttered from the darkness. "The storm is hungry." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Arthur, unlock the door. I need to go home." He didn't move. He just stood by the door, staring out into the rain. I tried to stay calm. I told him I was going to use the restroom. I knew there was a back exit through the break room. If I could just get to that door, I could run to my car. I walked quickly to the back of the office. I reached the rear door and pushed the handle. It wouldn't budge. I looked down. A thick metal chain was looped through the handles, secured with a padlock. We never chained that door. Arthur must have done it earlier. He had trapped us inside. Here is a question for you guys. If you were in my shoes, locked in a dark office with a stranger, would you try to fight him, or would you hide? Let me know in the comments below. I turned around and saw a faint beam of light coming down the hallway. Arthur was walking toward me with a flashlight, holding it under his chin so the shadows made his eyes look hollow. He was smiling a crooked smile. "I told you," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "I just want to keep you safe from the storm." I didn't wait to hear more. I ducked into the supply closet next to the break room and pulled the door shut, leaving the tiniest crack open. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs like a hammer. I watched through the crack as Arthur walked slowly past the closet. He wasn't whistling. He was humming. A low, vibrating hum that I could feel in my chest. The beam of his flashlight swept across the floor, right in front of my hiding spot. He stopped. He stood right there for what felt like an eternity. I could hear his wet boots squishing on the carpet. Suddenly, a massive crack of thunder shook the entire building. It was so loud, it sounded like an explosion. Arthur turned his head toward the noise and walked back toward the front of the office. I knew this was my only chance. I waited until his footsteps faded. Then I slipped out of the closet. I crept toward the lobby, staying low behind the cubicles. When I got to the front, I saw that the wind had blown a heavy tree branch into the glass front door. The safety glass was shattered. Rain was blowing inside. Arthur was nowhere in sight. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted through the broken glass, out into the pouring rain. I didn't care that I was getting drenched. I ran to my car, fumbled with my keys, and locked the doors the second I was inside. I sped out of that parking lot and didn't look back once. The police investigated the next day. Arthur was gone. His car was still in the lot, unlocked, with his wallet and phone inside. He had vanished. But inside his desk, they found a map of the town, with my address circled in red ink. I quit that job the next day. I don't know where Arthur went or why he chose me, but every time it storms, I make sure my doors are locked, and I never, ever stay late at work alone.